Okay, we'll now turn to the back of the bulletin and read the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 51 to 58. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews that disputed among themselves, saying, How can this man give us flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink its blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. For those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. This is God good news for all of God's people.
Thanks be to God.
Let's bow our heads in prayer. Lord, I ask for your grace and your wisdom in these words of mine. For your hearts are the ones that are gathered here. May these words be yours in your Son's name. Amen. So the story goes that there was this guy, and he was on one of those little commuter planes, and not a big one. I mean, not a four-seater, but it was big enough to have a flight attendant and a pilot in uniform and the whole bit. And so it was this little flight that was going to be going from Seattle to San Francisco. And as it happened, they had to make a slightly unscheduled stop in Sacramento. Little problem going on with the plane, nothing that was a big deal. It was going to get fixed in about an hour or so. And so the attendant came through the cabin, and he said, we're going to be on the ground for about 50 minutes or so. If you want to deplane, that's fine. Just come back, in about 50 minutes or so. You've got time to get off and stretch your legs, because we're going to be on the ground in Sacramento for about that much time. And so that's fine. Everybody kind of filed off the plane for a little while to catch breath. And there was one guy that was left, and the guy that was traveling, the guy that we're talking about, noticed that he was blind. And he knew that he was blind because he was traveling with a seeing eye dog in the seat right next to him. And he also knew one other thing that was going on with this guy. He knew that he was a regular on this particular commuter flight. He knew this because the flight attendant knew him by name, and also it turned out that as he was sitting there, as this guy's trying to get off the plane himself, he notices that the captain comes out of the cockpit and says, "Hey, Bill, we're going to be on the ground in Sacramento for about 50 minutes or so. If you want to get out and stretch your legs, you sure can." And Bill, the guy with the sight problem, said, "I'm fine, but my dog could sure, use some exercise a little bit, and he's getting kind of cramped in the airplane. So would you mind?" And so the pilot, this one. You can tell where it's going, though. I want you to think about the optics of this point, okay? Here's the pilot, and he's got his aviator sunglasses on at the same time, walking off the plane with a seeing eye dog. Think about it. The guy that's reporting this moment says there was a rush on the counter of people trying to cancel or change their flight, or if not change their flight, change their whole airline. I'm never flying on those people again. And the moral of the story is that things aren't always what they appear. That's kind of the thing with this particular scripture, because I guarantee you things are not what they appear, and yet they still kind of are. The Romans, at this particular time when this scripture was going on, and I'll cover what time it was in just a couple minutes, but the Romans who were trying to discredit this early Christian community spread this wonderful rumor that's based on this particular scripture. They said that this early sect that followed this crucified rabbi were cannibals. Now take a hard look at this scripture and you can kind of see where it's coming from. Because Jesus says very clearly, this is what you got to do. to have life in me. I loved John Zaff's take on this in Bible study on Thursday morning when he said without batting an eye, you know what, if that's the case, there's not enough Jesus to go around, is there? So obviously there's something going on here. This is not just an appearance kind of a moment. It's not what it feels, what it looks like on the surface. We've got to get deeper in this. Because quite frankly, this particular piece of scripture is one of those passages that a lot of pastors will say, gosh, is there anything else I can preach on besides that? Because this takes some unpacking. 2,000 years ago, these words were hard to hear. And they're difficult to hear now. Because on the surface, they're just gross. But deep down, they challenge our very hearts. Best way to understand this particular scripture is to get underneath what's really happening here at this point. Jesus says, in the first verse that Bo just read, and I'm so glad that we got Bo to read this scripture this morning, because I love that deep voice, because especially all we needed was, pardon me if I go really heretical, but all we needed was a slightly Transylvanian accent as he's reading about so sorry, had to do that. But I want you to think about this. The Jewish audience that was hearing this is a Hebrew audience, and the phrase flesh and blood is one of those things that talks about if a Hebrew individual would talk about flesh and blood, what he's talking about is something that is so basic and intimate to who he is, exactly who he is, everything that he is, or she. By saying that phrase. Now, David Lose, who is a theologian, a scholar, he was a seminary professor, he's also a Lutheran pastor at this point, serving a church, writes about this passage and says this, about that phrase, the phrase flesh and blood, to the Hebrew refers to the whole person, heart, mind, spirit, feelings, hopes, dreams, fears, concerns, everything. Everything in Jesus. Lose goes on to say, you see the whole of God in this moment, in Jesus, meets who we are. To love and to redeem and sustain the whole of who we are, good, bad, and ugly. That's what Jesus is offering here. That's what Jesus is trying to get across as a point. Now, I want to remind you, now in a couple of weeks, not next weekend, but the weekend after that, we're going to celebrate Holy Communion. And I hope everybody here is there on that Sunday. And I hope you bring a friend. Because we will say pretty much these exact same words that Bo just read out of the 6th chapter of John. We will talk about a man who gave his life. We'll talk about a man who offered his body and shed his blood. And we will say those words. And we'll say them in a way that is very similar to what Bo just read. Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And when the cup was offered, he said to his disciples, take and drink. This is my blood, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins, and do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. We say those words every month, every time we gather for communion, and not just in this church, but in just about every other church that celebrates communion, or calls it the Eucharist, or calls it the Great Thanksgiving, or calls it by another name. But we share in that. How often have we heard those words? And we've just passed them by. I had a conversation with a friend just the other day who has a son. And I know this guy. And I know him as a very thoughtful and very caring individual. And yet he has said that he doesn't want to do this. He doesn't feel right in celebrating communion. I have yet to track him down and find out the exact reason, but I wonder if it's not because this is important. Something very specific is happening here, and he doesn't want to take it lightly. And so in our conversation and Bible study throughout the week, a couple of folks have mentioned, in fact, in both of our Bible studies, very independent, very different groups, both raised the point about taking communion and being in this moment and coming up and sharing in the body and blood of Christ. But that's something that we shouldn't take lightly, that we shouldn't do just off the cuff. And if our hearts aren't into it, that maybe we need to think twice about coming up, and maybe we need to just ask for, in Roman Catholic tradition, if you're not part of that congregation or part of the group or part of that faith, we ask for a blessing. And I've done that in any number of Catholic churches over time. Because they take that moment very, very, very seriously. Now, in the United Methodist tradition, we celebrate an open table because we recognize that perhaps it is at that exact moment that we need that much grace. But I couldn't disagree with the people in Bible study at both times, and maybe even some of our brothers and sisters in faith in other denominations that don't have an open table, that say that there might just be moments when you just need to come up and just ask for a blessing for that moment. Now, as a good United Methodist, I would counter and say, you know what, that's exactly when you need Jesus. Full-on Jesus, body and blood Jesus. That's exactly when you need that inbreaking of the Spirit that comes to you in your most broken time. But I couldn't disagree that there just might be a moment when I've had to come up to the table and say, I just can't, but Lord, love me anyway. Unless we are willing to take this personally and come to this moment and be here in this time, to recognize what's happening in that sacrament, or just to take it and take it lightly and not even really think about it, just go through the motion and, is the bread, really fresh today, or is the juice a little on the tart side, or am I what am I going to do with my little cup? Is it going to spill over or whatever? If we're locked into those sort of extraneous details, and we miss the moment of what's actually happening here, we risk leaving our hearts hungry and thirsty and starving to death. Because we've not given our hearts the opportunity to be fed. And so the language that Jesus uses will not let us take this moment lightly. To pass this off as just another clever little story that Jesus is telling us, another metaphor, another parable to try and make a point. This is so much deeper than that. Jesus doubles down on this language, this image of actually consuming who he is at his most basic level, and then doubles down again and says it more clearly. You have to eat who I am in order to be part of me. He is absolutely not letting up on this. Unless he becomes a part of us, a living, breathing part of every hope and dream and fear that courses through us, that makes us who we are, unless we allow Jesus to be part of us, then we are not letting God deep enough into our lives to really matter. Now, let me just run through that again, because that's the takeaway, folks. Unless he becomes part of us, a living and breathing part of every hope and dream and fear that courses through us, that makes us who we are, then we are not letting God deep enough into our hearts to matter. Because isn't this where we need saving? At that level. Not the surface level that we think is safe, but the deep level, where hearts are broken and our shameful secrets lay, and where our pride tries to keep that from becoming too terribly obvious. It's at that elemental level that drinking deep from the well of Christ, God offers to us that grace that heals us and saves us in ways that a half-hearted run of the communion table just won't do. This is what changes us at a level that makes a difference in our lives. We talk about transformation. The mission statement of the United Methodist Church, you've heard me say this before, it's the transformation of those around us. Making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Because if we leave our hearts broken and battered and hurt, quite frankly, we're no good to a whole lot of people. We can think that for a while, but hurt hearts have very little to share far too often. I'm not saying you've got to be perfect and everything's got to be right with everything that's going on. Sometimes it is from our wounds that we can reach out and help others, but you can only hold your breath for so long. You have to let Jesus inside to heal you. Because it is in that healed heart that others can find Christ. Now, I told you I'd talk to you a little bit about the Gospel of John and when it was written. Just to give you a little context of what was going on at the time. It was written about the end of the first century into the beginning of the second century, around the 90s, in the late 90s and the early 100s to 110 in Jewish culture. It would have been about, at the earliest time, about 70 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So this early church has been going along for about as long as some of you have been alive. And they have formed traditions and they know what's going on and they have celebrated communion as a part of the nature and the function of their church and they know what's happening there. Now keep in mind also that in the culture what's going on around them, around 66 to 73 AD, or as biblical scholars say, CE or Common Era, between 66 and 73 was the first Jewish-Roman war. And it laid waste to large parts of Jerusalem and the area. And a huge impact in what was going on in the culture at the time. And that was just a couple of decades before the Gospel of John was written. A couple of decades after that, around 123 or so AD, there would be the Bar Kokhba revolt. That was the second nationalist revolt that the Jewish people had to try and reclaim their homeland, and it didn't work any better than the first one did. In this moment of persecution of not only the Jews, you have this Christian sect, they're not even called Christians at this point, not yet. We're still being, there's still the way, there's still understanding of who they are. And in that moment, we not only have the persecution of the Jews, but we also have the persecution of the Christians as well. And they are a group that is really struggling to find their own identity. So in the Gospel of John, we have this common thread that goes through of the early Christians trying to make themselves, set themselves apart from their Jewish ancestry, their Jewish heritage. And how is this different? How are they different from the Jewish people that are around them that are so much a part of their history? And this is part of that moment. This understanding of communion, this nature of what it means and what it says to the people around them. That this moment of personal relationship with God, through this personal understanding and remembrance of an individual's act of love and grace and sacrifice, sets them apart. So for that to be taken lightly, for it to be tossed off, to be just an appearance kind of a thing, that I'm going to go to the temple, or I'm going to go to the house church, I'm going to be there, and I'll celebrate communion, and it'll be fine, and all my neighbors will see, what a good follower of Jesus I am. And so the author of the Gospel of John who knows, has a body of Jesus' sayings and Jesus' work that he's working on to pull this gospel together, this standard document, this baseline document for his community there in the area. And he knows that these are the words that the people of this community need to hear. That this thing that we do connects us with Jesus and with God in ways that nothing else can. And if we can't get this right, then we're spinning our wheels. If we can't get this right, if we aren't bringing Christ into us in a way that is better and deeper and more whole than anything else we do, then we're wasting our time. Just going through the motions will reduce this moment of communion, of Eucharist, which by the time that this gospel had been written had been celebrated for decades. If we go through the motions on this, then we reduce this to nothing more than a little bite of bread and a little drink of juice. Just looking like a Christian on the outside will not do. Jesus offers himself. This is more than knowing Jesus in our head, but living Jesus in our hearts. And it transforms us. Transforms who we are, not just what we do. Late first century and early century Christians who heard these words would go out of that place and meet judgment and hatred and rejection. Not only from their neighbors, but from the very laws that governed the area. They needed a faith in something that was deeper than the ritual and the show. They needed the strength of conviction that would give them the strength to face what they would face. And that comes only from having Christ in our hearts. Only then could they and we now withstand the storms. When the waves are coming over the rails, I need something more than just a for-show Jesus. I need something more to resist the temptation of power and wealth and prestige that, quite frankly, would come pretty easily as long as you don't have to worry about that morality stuff. And only then, with Christ in our hearts, can we choose living bread that continues to give us that strength to be the Christian that God would call us to be. Because everything else, even if it looks good, leaves us starving for something that is real. It leaves us spiritually malnourished and never knowing Jesus as the intersection between our pain and God's grace. So here's my hope for you today. I hope I leave you with a hunger and a thirst that can't be satisfied by anything less than Jesus. The real Jesus. Now, as I wrote those words, I had this image, and I don't know if you've ever run across this particular bobblehead, but it's the cool Jesus. It's sometimes known as the surfer dude Jesus. You know, and he's given the wink and the kind of thing. If that's the Jesus that you have super glued to your dashboard in your car, God bless you. But I hope your faith is deeper than that. Just say it. I hope it's deeper than the shiny fish that's super glued to your tailgate. I hope you know the real Jesus. It gets under your skin and deep in your gut and becomes so much a part of you that you lose track of where you begin and where Jesus ends. I want you to know the real Jesus, and I want you to be hungry for that person. The real Jesus that won't settle for appearances. Because in 2 weeks, that's what's on the menu. Let's bow our heads and pray. Gracious and loving God, prepare our hearts to encounter you. prepare us to be changed. Empty us of those things that would keep us prideful and unknowingly empty. Lord, make us hungry and thirsty for nothing less than you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.